his own wedding, a groom's arrogance leads to a shocking accusation against an NBA legend. What starts as a careless assumption quickly spirals into a powerful lesson in humility. Witness how one moment of ignorance turns into an unforgettable reckoning. Like, subscribe, and share your thoughts on this eye-opening journey. The grand wedding of Julian Thompson and Ella Madison was nothing short of spectacular. Set in the lavish gardens of a Crestview estate, every detail was curated to perfection. Designer-clad guests sipped champagne under twinkling fairy lights, while a live orchestra played soft, melodic tunes. The air buzzed with laughter, conversation, and the unmistakable energy of a night to remember. At the heart of it all stood Julian, the 25-year-old groom, effortlessly charming in his crisp white tuxedo, reveling in the admiration of friends and family. Confident, polished, entitled. As he moved through the crowd, Julian's attention flickered to the gold watch on his wrist, a family heirloom, customized with his initials, a symbol of his legacy, wealth, and status. He never let it out of his sight. Until now. During the cocktail hour, while adjusting his cufflinks, he momentarily placed the watch on a nearby table. A guest called his name, and in that fleeting distraction, the watch disappeared. Panic set in. Julian's eyes darted across the room. It was gone. He frantically searched the table, knocking over napkins and champagne flutes. His heartbeat pounded in his ears. And then, his gaze landed on Shaquille O'Neal. A towering presence in a sleek black suit, exuding quiet confidence, Shaq stood near the buffet table, sipping water and speaking to another guest. Julian didn't recognize him. And that, in his mind, was enough. "Lucas," Julian hissed at his best man, "someone took my watch." "Are you sure you left it there?" Lucas asked, scanning the bustling room. Julian's voice dropped, sharp and tense. "Of course, I'm sure. And I think I know who took it." Lucas stiffened, following Julian's gaze. "Julian, don't." But Julian wasn't listening. With purposeful strides, he crossed the room, his presence demanding attention. Conversations hushed. Curious eyes followed. By the time he reached Shaq, a silent crowd had gathered. Julian's voice cut through the tension like a knife. Did you see a gold watch on that table?" Shaq turned, his expression calm but questioning. "No, I didn't," he replied evenly. Julian folded his arms, voice rising. "Really? Because it's funny how it vanished, and you're the only person here I don't know." A flicker of irritation crossed Shaq's face, but his tone remained composed. "I'm certain I haven't touched your watch." The room fell silent. Ella, standing nearby with her bridesmaids, froze in disbelief. "Julian, what are you doing?" she whispered, hurrying to his side. Julian ignored her, his frustration boiling over into something uglier. "You say you didn't take it, but how do I know you're telling the truth? People like you always think they can get away with things." The words landed like a slap. A collective gasp rippled through the guests. For the first time, Shaq's calm exterior faltered, but only for a moment. He steadied himself, his voice now lower, edged with quiet anger. "People like me," he repeated, locking eyes with Julian. "What exactly do you mean by that?" Julian shrugged, arrogance unchecked. "You know what I mean. You don't belong here. This isn't your kind of crowd." The air grew heavy. The murmurs of the crowd turned into stunned silence. Shaq took a step closer. Towering. Unshaken. Unmoved. His voice was steady. Firm. Unforgiving. "I suggest you rethink your words. Not for my sake, but for yours. What happens next will shock you. What would you have done in this situation? Drop your thoughts in the comments." "Julian, stop it," Ella hissed, gripping his arm. "You're embarrassing yourself." But Julian shrugged her off, his voice rising. "Someone has to say it, Ella. He can't just walk in here and act like he's better than us." The room had fallen silent. All eyes were on them. Shaquille O'Neal stood firm, his face unreadable, his breathing slow and controlled. He refused to be provoked. "I have nothing to prove to you," he said simply. Before Julian could fire back, another voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Julian, that's enough." The commanding tone belonged to Robert Thompson, Julian's father. A tall, powerful man in his late 50s, Robert was someone who demanded respect without asking for it. And right now, his face was a mixture of anger and disappointment. Julian's bravado flickered. "Dad, A sharp wave of Robert's hand silenced him. Not another word. He turned to Shaquille, his expression softening. "Mr. O'Neal, I am so deeply sorry for my son's behavior. I had no idea this would happen." Shaquille nodded, his composure unwavering. "Apology accepted, Mr. Thompson," he said. "But perhaps your son should be the one apologizing." Robert turned back to Julian, his voice cold. "Do you even know who this man is?" Julian hesitated. The confidence that once radiated from him crumbled into uncertainty. "No, but he." "This is Shaquille O'Neal," Robert said, his voice rising slightly. "One of the greatest basketball players of all time. A philanthropist. A man who has done more for this family than you will ever understand." Julian's jaw dropped. His face drained of color. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Ella's eyes widened in shock. "Wait, what?" Julian stammered. Robert's jaw tightened, his disappointment sharp enough to cut through steel. "Yes, Julian," he said firmly. "Shaquille O'Neal is the reason this wedding is even happening today." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. "Years ago," Robert continued, his voice steady but tinged with raw emotion, "our family was on the brink of bankruptcy. Thompson Industries was failing. No bank would lend us a dime. I thought I had lost everything. And then I met Shaquille O'Neal." The room was dead silent. "He barely knew me," Robert said, his voice thick with something unspoken. "Yet he believed in our vision. He supported us. His generosity helped keep our business afloat. Without him, we wouldn't have recovered. Without him, this wedding wouldn't even be happening." Julian stood frozen. His once unshakable confidence had shattered under the weight of his father's words. The crowd stared in disbelief. Some whispered in hushed voices. Others shook their heads, disgusted. Julian's mouth opened. No words came out. Ella looked at him differently now, not with admiration, but with pity. "Dad," Julian's voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't know." Robert's glare burned through him. "That's the problem, Julian," he said, voice firm, disappointment dripping from every word. "You didn't know. And yet you assumed. You accused an honored guest without a shred of evidence. And worse, you let your prejudice guide you." The word stung. Julian looked down at his shoes, his entire body radiating shame. "But let me be clear," Robert continued, voice sharper now. "This isn't just about the watch. It's about how you treated Mr. O'Neal. How you let your own bias blind you. I thought I raised you better than this." The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Shaquille, who had remained silent through Robert's speech, finally spoke. His voice was calm, but commanding. "Mr. Thompson," he said, looking at Robert, "I appreciate your words. But I think your son needs to hear this from me." Robert stepped aside without hesitation. All eyes turned to Shaquille. The air was thick with tension. Shaq's gaze locked onto Julian's, piercing, unwavering. And then, he spoke. Julian felt the full weight of Shaquille O'Neal's presence. It wasn't just his 7 feet 1 inch frame towering over him, it was something deeper. Morally. Ethically. As a man. Shaquille's expression held no rage or condescension, only a quiet dignity that made Julian feel smaller than ever before. When Shaquille finally spoke, his voice was steady. Measured. Unshaken. "Julian," he began, his tone firm but not unkind. "I understand that emotions can run high in situations like this. Losing something valuable can make anyone upset. But the way you chose to handle this? It wasn't just wrong. It was offensive. Deeply offensive." Julian flinched, but Shaquille didn't stop. "You didn't know who I was. And yet, you felt entitled to humiliate me. To single me out. To assume the worst about me because of how I look. You let your prejudice dictate your actions." Shaquille's words hung in the air like a gavel striking down a verdict. The crowd held its breath. Even the orchestra had stopped playing, their instruments now resting on their laps as they watched the moment unfold. Julian nodded slightly, his confidence shattered. But Shaquille wasn't finished. "This isn't about a watch." His words echoed Robert's earlier reprimand. "This is about character. About how we treat people, especially those we think are different from us. What you did tonight, it says more about you than it does about me." The silence in the room was deafening. But then, Shaquille's expression softened, just slightly. "I'm not here to humiliate you, Julian." His voice was calm now, almost fatherly. "I'm here to teach you something." Julian looked up, his eyes filled with regret, shame, and something else, understanding. Shaquille held his gaze. "Life will present you with moments like this. Moments where you can either rise above your own ignorance and grow, or stay exactly where you are. The question is, which path will you choose?" For the first time that night, Julian truly heard him. He swallowed hard. His voice trembled. I'm sorry." It was barely a whisper. Shaquille nodded, but his expression remained serious. "Words are a start, Julian. But actions matter more. If you truly mean it, then show it. Not just to me, but to everyone you meet." Robert stepped forward, his voice firm but supportive. "Julian, this is your moment. Apologize properly. Learn from this. I won't tolerate this kind of behavior in our family." Julian took a deep breath. He turned to Shaquille, his entire body trembling with humility. "Mr. O'Neill, I can't express how sorry I am. For what I said. For what I did. For how I judged you. It was wrong. And there's no excuse for it. I've been arrogant. Blind to my own ignorance. But I promise you, I will change." Shaquille studied Julian for a moment. Then, finally, he extended his hand. His grip was firm. His expression was unreadable until a faint, knowing smile crossed his face. "Apology accepted." The room exhaled. A ripple of applause and relieved murmurs spread through the crowd. The tension that had held the wedding hostage finally began to dissipate, replaced by something unexpected. "Hope." Ella stepped forward, placing a hand on Julian's arm, whispering softly, "Thank you for doing the right thing." Robert turned to Shaquille, his expression filled with gratitude. "Mr. O'Neill, I can't thank you enough. Not just for tonight, but for everything you've done for our family. I'm deeply sorry for my son's behavior, and I promise you, he will learn from this." Shaquille nodded, his composure unshaken. "Don't thank me, Mr. Thompson. Your kindness to me in the past has always mattered. Just make sure your son learns to carry that same kindness forward." Robert nodded solemnly, his respect for Shaquille only deepening. The confrontation was over. But its impact lingered in the air. The ceremony eventually resumed, but the atmosphere had shifted. Conversations were different now. More reflective. More aware. Guests who might have once whispered behind Shaquille's back now regarded him with admiration. Julian remained quiet for much of the evening, his usual arrogance replaced with introspection. He stood at the altar beside Ella, his hands trembling slightly as he held hers. He tried to focus on the vows, the promises of love and commitment. But his mind was elsewhere. The shame still gnawed at him. The words he had spoken. the racist assumptions he had made, the baseless accusation of theft, and worst of all, the realization of who Shaquille truly was. It all swirled in his head, threatening to overshadow what should have been the happiest day of his life. Then, as Ella softly recited her vows, she gave Julian's hand a gentle squeeze. A silent message. "We'll get through this." Her voice, filled with love and hope for their future, offered a small measure of comfort to his troubled heart. Meanwhile, Shaquille sat among the guests, observing the ceremony with a calm, unreadable expression. He had nothing left to say. Because at the end of the day, his dignity spoke for itself. The events of the evening had shaken the wedding to its core, but Shaquille O'Neal had no intention of letting bitterness linger. He wasn't a man who held on to grudges. He believed in transformation, in the power of humility and growth. And tonight, he could only hope that Julian had learned something valuable. A moment of reflection. After the ceremony, the newlyweds moved into the reception hall for their first dance. The guests clapped politely as Julian and Ella swayed to the soft melody of the live band, but Julian felt every set of eyes in the room on him. Judging. Whispering. Remembering. Ella, ever perceptive, leaned in during the dance, her voice soft but firm. "Julian, let it go. What's done is done. You've apologized, now show everyone you can be better." Her words struck a nerve. Julian nodded slightly, determination flickering in his gaze. He would not let the night end without taking the first step toward redemption. A hard conversation. As the night wore on, the reception hall buzzed with laughter and music, but Julian's mind was elsewhere. Across the room, Shaquille stood near the bar, engaged in quiet conversation with Robert. Julian hesitated. Shame. Fear. Doubt. Would Shaquille even want to speak to him? Robert, sensing his son's turmoil, gave him a pointed look, stern but encouraging. Julian had a choice to make. Taking a deep breath, he walked forward. Each step heavy. Each step necessary. "Mr. O'Neal," Julian said softly, drawing Shaquille and Robert's attention. "May I have a word?" Shaquille turned to him, his expression neutral but attentive. "Of course." Julian glanced at his father, who nodded once before stepping away, giving them privacy. Now, it was just the two of them. And the weight of the moment pressed down on Julian like a storm cloud about to break. "I wanted to say something earlier," Julian began, his voice low and uncertain. "But I didn't know how to find the right words." He exhaled sharply, forcing himself to push past his own discomfort. "I know I already apologized, but I need to say it again. Because what I did tonight was wrong. Completely, unforgivably wrong. I let my own ignorance and prejudice control me. And I disrespected you in a way that no one should ever be treated." Julian's voice faltered, but he kept going. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. But I hope you can find it in your heart to accept my apology." Shaquille studied him carefully, his deep, thoughtful gaze unwavering. Seconds felt like hours. Finally, he spoke. "Julian, what you said and did tonight was deeply hurtful. Not just to me, but to everyone who witnessed it. But I believe in second chances." Shaquille's tone was firm but not harsh. "What matters now is not the apology itself, but what you do moving forward. Words are fleeting. Actions show the true measure of a man." Julian nodded earnestly, his shoulders squaring for the first time that night. "I promise you, Mr. O'Neal, I'll be different. Tonight has been a wake-up call. And I'll do whatever it takes to be better. I'm ashamed of who I was. But I want to change." Shaquille studied him for a long moment. Then, finally, he extended his hand. His grip was firm. His expression, softened by a faint but knowing smile. "I'll hold you to that promise." Julian exhaled a shaky breath, one he hadn't even realized he was holding. "Thank you." It was quiet. Sincere. As Shaquille returned to his seat, Julian felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Clarity. For the first time, he recognized the privilege and prejudice that had shaped his worldview. And for the first time, he made a promise to himself. He would confront it. He would dismantle it. No matter how uncomfortable the journey might be. A journey of redemption. In the weeks after the wedding, Julian didn't let the lesson fade. It wasn't easy. Looking inward never is. But change requires effort. He started by educating himself, reading books, attending seminars, and learning about racial equality and the systemic issues he had been blind to. He reached out to mentors and leaders in his community, asking for guidance. But most importantly, he took action. Julian began volunteering, spending weekends mentoring underprivileged youth and helping them with education and career aspirations. Through these experiences, he gained perspective. He realized how much he had taken for granted. He saw how different life was for those who weren't born into privilege. And he understood, in a way he never had before, just how deep his ignorance had run. A silent acknowledgement. Throughout his journey, Julian reached out to Shaquille, not for validation, but out of genuine gratitude. He wrote letters, detailing how that single night had changed his life. Shaquille rarely responded. But when he did, it was always short, always simple, always direct. Good. Keep going. And Julian did. Because for the first time in his life, he understood that true change isn't about proving something to others. It's about becoming the kind of person who no longer needs to. A new path begins. Julian's transformation didn't happen overnight. But it happened. The once arrogant, entitled Groom became thoughtful, compassionate, and self-aware. He no longer just spoke about change, he lived it. His father, Robert, saw the shift and couldn't hide his pride. "You've come a long way, son," he told Julian one evening. "I think Shaquille would be proud of the man you're becoming." A meeting of growth. Months later, Julian decided to reach out to Shaquille. He wanted to thank him. Properly. Shaquille, curious about Julian's progress, agreed to meet. The setting was a small cafe in downtown Riverwood, a quiet, humble place, far from the grandeur of that fateful wedding night. When Shaquille arrived, Julian immediately stood to greet him. His demeanor had changed, no longer brash, no longer entitled. Just genuine. Humble. Grateful. "Thank you for meeting me, Mr. O'Neill," Julian said sincerely. Shaquille gave a faint smile as he took a seat. "Call me Shaq." He nodded. "What can I do for you, Julian?" Julian took a deep breath. "I just wanted to thank you. Not just for forgiving me, but for changing my life. Your grace that night, it showed me what true strength and dignity look like." He paused, his voice filled with sincerity. "I've been working hard to become a better person. And I owe that to you." Shaquille nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I'm glad to hear that." He leaned forward slightly, his deep, steady voice carrying weight. "Growth isn't easy. But it's necessary. Remember, the journey doesn't end here. Keep challenging yourself. And more importantly, help others along the way." Julian smiled, his gratitude shining through. "I will. Thank you, Shaq. For everything." The two men parted ways, not with grand gestures, not with dramatic speeches, but with understanding. Their interaction was brief, but it was profound. As Julian stepped out of the cafe, he felt lighter, not because the past was erased, but because he was finally walking toward a better future. Shaquille, ever the quiet leader, left knowing that his message had reached someone who truly needed it. A story that inspired change. Julian's journey of self-awareness and redemption became more than just his own. It became an example, a testament to the power of humility, education, the willingness to change. People in Crestview, who had once dismissed uncomfortable conversations, began confronting their own biases. Conversations shifted. Perspectives evolved. Change began. Meanwhile, Shaquille O'Neal continued his work, not seeking recognition, not demanding applause. He simply kept doing what he always did. Lifting others up. Helping where he could. Making a difference without asking for credit. Because true strength isn't loud. It's steady. It's quiet. It's real. A toast to the future. Years later, at another family gathering in Crestview, Robert Thompson stood before the crowd, raising his glass. His voice was thick with emotion. To Shaquille O'Neal, the man who not only helped our family in times of need, but who helped my son become the man he was meant to be. Thank you for showing us all what true kindness and strength look like. Across the room, Shaquille raised his glass, his eyes meeting Julian's. In that moment, no words were needed. Because their journey, though born out of conflict, had become a story of redemption, growth, and the unshakable power of grace.